hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator.
All right, welcome back to the next episode of BC Law's Just Law podcast. I'm Tom Blakely. We're joined by two great guests here today to discuss the topic of first-generation professionals. We're visited by John Marley, who's an associate, and Morgan Lewis, who works with their litigation team to advise clients on an array of matters, including arbitrations, complex commercial litigation, and securities litigation. John is committed to mentoring, especially students from first-generation and minority backgrounds, as well as working on pro bono matters, including housing, asylum, immigration, and the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. Sydney Blomstrom is a 2L at BC Law who heads up our first-generation professionals affinity group and student organization. Well, welcome to both of you. Thanks for coming out to chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to get started with a simple question. This topic of first-generation professionals, FGP, which is, what does that term FGP mean to you? I guess, John, we'll start with you.
Sure. When I think about that term, I think about people from a background where you don't have white-collar ancestry, I guess. You look back, there's not going to be a doctor, lawyer, banker in the family, the type of environment that it's typical in the legal industry now, where you don't have that similar, shared history of maybe going skiing in the Alps. You don't have the house in Aspen. You don't, you've never been to the Maldives. It's a more humble background, typically. In my opinion, there could be people from, with blue-collar families who are fabulously wealthy. Mm-hmm. And then you have those kind of connections, which, you can decide where that qualifies in your mind. But for me, it really goes back to people who, very humble background, family not really in the white-collar industry, and where, as law students, we get into this space, it's a little bit, unnerving and, new ground for us.
Yeah. Sydney, how about you?
I would agree with that. I would also just kind of add how I feel like when we're trying to promote FGP on campus, typically people whose parents went to college, they don't really think it really applies to them, or their parents went to grad school but in a different field and they don't really think it applies to them. But I think when trying to promote these resources, we really try to focus on asking questions like, did your family actually come to law school? Because there's a lot of resources that if your parents kind of come from that humble background, you might not have access to.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I agree with both of your responses. I think that, John, to your point, it's sort of like that white-collar background, because you can say, well, first-gen college, first-gen law school, and I think it's really a broad term. I think really what we're talking about is, do you have a background in this sort of, in these social circles, in these types of networks, which is certainly a lot of this. Just getting to know you guys both a little bit more. Just talk a little bit more about your background before law school, and what you were up to before you made the decision to come to law school, where you're from, anything of that nature. Sydney, what are you?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Western Massachusetts, so Boston isn't too far away from me. I went to Mount Holyoke College for undergrad, and I graduated in 2020, so that was kind of a weird COVID year.
An interesting time to graduate.
Yeah. So I always knew that I wanted to take one gap year in between my undergrad and law school, but I thought that would maybe be doing something interesting, maybe, I don't know, trying to move somewhere that I haven't been to before, but I just ended up taking some part-time work doing after-school teaching at Breakthrough Greater Boston, and also spending time just doing LSATs, all that stuff.
Oh yeah, it's fun times. John, how about you?
Sure. Originally from Jamaica. Family moved to Florida when I was about 5. Hung out there for a while. Went to undergrad at Stanford. I studied history. Figured I was going to go into the military or law school. Military didn't work out. A lot of injuries. But I took 4 years off, actually, in between undergrad and law school. I worked largely in the construction industry, doing some engineering work and then in some business development work. Realized that, there was, candidly speaking, there's going to be a lot more money in law.
Yeah, sure.
I looked at it, my family didn't do too well after the 2008 recession. I was like, I got to do something different here.
Yeah.
And law school, I always promised myself if by 24, 25, I hadn't found it yet, I'd go to law school, and I went, and I've loved it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm glad that it worked out that way. Yeah, I mean, for myself, if the accent doesn't just completely give it away, I'm from Boston. My family's from Boston. Grew up in the sort of real estate construction industry. In terms of going to school, I went to Bentley University, got my business degree there. Actually, started a business that I ran all the way up until law school. I got more interested in sort of like legal issues, like policy discussions that related to a lot of the business matters that would come up, in my work that sort of pulled me, in this direction. And, when I came to law school, came here to BC, started in fall of 2020, which you talk about graduating in 2020, starting law school in 2020 was a whole other beast. But no, it's been great, but it's, certainly been an experience for someone like myself. And I guess for each of you, you learn a lot about, people's backgrounds and in the law and networking, sort of the social dynamics of all of this. And that's what's really, brought this first generation topic, to the fore as I've gone through. You meet more people and, you learn about what I think is a pretty, important dynamic. So I guess just, going forward, what, was your journey to law school like in terms of your first gen experience? Like, how did that impact, I think the term LSAT might have come up a few minutes ago. You're going through that, which obviously costs a lot of money. You're trying to figure out, okay, well, what score do I need and what school do I need to go to get the job that I want to get? You're trying to piece all of this together. So I'm just curious, for each of you, like what that experience was like, and in light of the sort of being new to this in this first generation capacity. John, I'll go to you.
Sure. So there are a couple different aspects to me that I felt that being first generation impacted. One was there was nobody in my family who is an alum of a particular university. I had no knowledge, no background, nobody guiding me, this university is going to be better in this space. It was really a blank canvas. I had to do it 100% on my own. Mm-hmm. They were very supportive. They were behind me all the way, but they really didn't have any ability to help me. The next thing is purely the finances. Mm. There's a cost to just signing up for I forget the name of the organization, but
LSAC.
LSAC, yeah. So you got to sign up for them, right?
Yeah.
Then you have
They're
to
not
pay.
A charity.
No, there's certainly no charity. And then you have to pay for every single law school application. Mm-hmm. Then you have to pay to send your LSAC information to each law school, mm-hmm. which in and of itself, I think at the time was $100 or $200.
I remember thinking about that. Like I'm checking out while I'm applying to schools. I'm like, I'm paying them $90, whatever the number is, to send a PDF.
The same one over and over.
Exactly.
It was incredible. And I started to run the numbers okay, if I want to apply to 10 law schools or 20 law schools, I'm looking at $1,000 or $2,000. Yeah. And that's not including the cost of the actual law school application. Mm-hmm. So for me, I ended up just taking a strategy was if a school didn't send me a fee application waiver, I just didn't apply. Yeah. That's really what it came down to. Yeah. And, thank God BC sent me a letter. I had never heard of BC before. I'd never even considered it. Mm-hmm. BC sent me a letter.
And you were in Florida at the time?
I was in Florida at the time. And they said, hey, come check us out. And, it's been great ever since.
Awesome. Yeah. Sydney?
Initially, I think just applying to law school felt very lonely for me at the time. Like I was kind of stuck in my room during the pandemic, taking the LSAT on my computer. Mm-hmm. Similarly, like my parents were very supportive of the whole journey, but sometimes, when talking to them about, kind of the logistics, why maybe I would want to go to like one school versus the other, sometimes those would be kind of like difficult conversations to have. And similarly, I just feel like it was kind of, the research was 100% on me to do to make sure that I was really making a good investment in my education.
Yeah, I think for myself, like luckily, I was somebody who just did sort of like a neurotic amount of research about how all of this works. I was finishing up undergrad at the time, and I went online, and I think there's like the marketing that law schools put out, and then there's like, and again, you can go overboard with like Reddit and like some of the websites because some of it just gets to be a little bit too precise, but there's like law school numbers, there's like LS data, I think was the other one, where it like kind of gives you a breakdown of exactly how this stuff works. And I actually, I had applied in undergrad, and then I decided I wanted to, work for a year and, get some more experience, save some money, and then, sort of reassess like where I wanted to go to school and apply a year later. And so I already had going into it like a good amount of exposure to how it worked, but like doing it, I think sort of like for the second go around, you really kind of come to understand like how the sausage is made, and you're like, all right, well, wait a minute. Like I've seen enough articles saying that like these schools probably don't want to look there, and you need to have like this scholarship for this to be worth it, because to get these jobs you have this percent. It's just like a big math problem that kind of gives you a headache at a certain point. But
Absolutely.
I talked to friends who were sort of in the same boat, who like maybe they're had a lawyer in the family, or like parents, or like in some way or another we're coming across people in these circles who might get that advice of like, hey, what do you want to do? Well, you need to go here. Whereas it sounds like for folks like us, you're doing a lot of that figuring out on your own to try to understand the way to go. But I think all good points, and it's kind of accurate to people's experience. It's just like sitting there and like, okay, well, it's going to cost this and I need to do that, and you just sort of go from there. So I wanted to ask, like, I guess when you got to law school, like, how did you feel initially? Like, I know, well, Sydney, I think you started 2021, I started 2020, so I sort of started law school on Zoom, I suppose. But in any event, when you first got to law school, like, how did that feel? I mean, it's obviously a nerve-wracking period of time for anyone, but, given that, like sort of like first-gen background, like, how did you feel? Like, you show up to campus, here you are, you're in law school, you're a law student, you did it. What was that like? Start with you, Sydney.
I feel like coming to campus just seems like, you feel like you have to follow this rule book.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a certain way to outline, there's a certain way to prepare for exams and to network. And then what I find out now as a 2L is that there's, 100 different ways to do things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was just a lot of confusion. What should I do? What's everyone else doing? How can I make sure I get to the point where I kind of want, certain jobs or a certain GPA that I might want? So I think, I don't know, it's just kind of, it's just like a lot of that confusion, and then coming to the realization that, I got into BC, I have the qualifications to be here, and, I have my certain method to the way I study, to the way I, network, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. John? Sure.
When I got here, I realized very quickly how little I actually knew about the legal profession, even law school.
Oh.
As I said, no lawyers in the family, no doctors, no bankers. So my experience with being a lawyer was TV.
Yeah.
Right? That's the truth. I came in thinking, hey, every lawyer goes to court. That's literally what I thought. Everybody, and if you watch Suits, I thought, okay, we all kind of do everything, right? And it was a shocking when professors on the first day start talking about, okay, who wants to do transactional law?
Yeah.
I'm like, what even is transactional law?
Right.
And then you start to discover very, very quickly that people have like plans going to law school. I want to go to this firm. I want to do X, I want to practice this type of law in this city. I didn't know the names of the firms.
Yep.
I didn't know the types of practice areas. I didn't know what cities were good for law. I mean, I was figured like New York is probably a good place to practice law. But other than that, it was really a blank slate. And that was kind of intimidating, because it's like I'm way behind. Not only am I behind academically or resource wise, because I'm trying to count every penny that I have. I also now need to figure out, I don't even have the right plan apparently, because everybody's got this plan and I didn't even know what the first page looked like.
Right. Yeah.
So, that was a shocking moment. You figure it out.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I remember that, like, early on, there's like this thing, do you want to do litigation or do you want to do transaction? You're like, well, wait, what kind of transactions? And you're trying to just, it seems like, get to, a place where, other people sort of already have like a baseline understanding of, how this all plays. Like, you're right, like this TV metaphor, I think you come in thinking of every, and we sort of teach through the case method, like law school kind of skews litigation, but nonetheless, I think you come in, you think, oh, well, lawyer lawsuits, like that's kind of what we're doing. And there's this whole other world, really the corporate side that, you don't come in with a lot of, awareness to, but, as you spend enough time around, BC law and in law school, you'll certainly come to learn that. But it is something where you feel like you kind of have to teach yourself. You're a little bit, behind the eight ball, and you have to catch up a bit.
I mean, you don't know what opportunities to look for.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never thought of or know about clerkships.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where to go to talk to attorneys. I don't know what firms to entertain. I didn't know that there were, A firms and B firms. It's like, oh, it's a law firm. Let's all do it. I didn't know that there was a market rate.
Right.
It really took a while to orient myself onto how the industry actually worked.
Yeah, for sure. Did you guys feel, as you're going through law school and you're 1L, you're 2L, you're getting some work, you're doing internships, you're doing different things, this topic of imposter syndrome, did that, how do you relate to that term that sort of gets tossed around in law school a bit? I guess that's Sydney.
I think kind of going back to you see your classmates coming into law school and they feel so sure of what they want to do and what practice area they want to go to, or they really know they want to go to maybe these certain firms. I kind of went into law school and I didn't have a goal. It's kind of like, I'll see what classes interest me. I'll see what opportunities I'm drawn to. So I think, not having that plan and not having those set goals kind of made me feel like, I guess that, I just kind of didn't know what I was doing. And maybe am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing in these classes? So I think that was kind of the main source of it. It's just, you see people who come into class and they're very, certain about the case law and they're very certain about their careers. And if you're not like that, sometimes you feel like, what am I doing here?
Yeah, exactly. John?
Yeah, for me, I'm of two minds. Yeah. One is I think I'm a smart person. I never think that I'm the smartest guy in the room, but I figure it's like, okay, I can be here. So I don't know the things that I should know. And, I kind of own that. And I said, all right, I'm going to figure out who looks like they know what they're doing. Where am I going to go find those resources? But of the second mind is like, wow, I have just like failed forward my whole life. I don't know what I'm doing, even practicing now. One of the partners will say, hey, John, can you take care of this? Can you do this? I'm going to trust you on this. I'm like, this guy, wow. If he didn't see me Googling, the name of, what is ESG as I'm about to go write this memo on it, you know what I mean? And I don't know. Even the head of our firm, as accomplished as she is, Jamie McKeon, still feels the element of imposter syndrome. But, I feel like it's a tool for strength where I use it to motivate me to be forward and not be complacent, because I'm always figuring I don't know what I'm doing, so let me double check this again.
Yeah.
Let me go find somebody else to tell me how am I going to do this right.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, we had so I'm doing a clinic this semester. We're doing the training for the clinic at the beginning, and sort of going around the room talking about things like even people who aren't first gen. I thought it was eye opening when somebody said, "Yeah, I didn't know how to electronically file something. Like I heard it was something that was done. Like I know people do that, but I had never before." Done that. And I think there's like that pressure, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or if you've had like a different experience. Like there's sort of that pressure to like feel like what we're doing and what we're talking about. And then like, to your point about Googling, ESG, like I think we all find a moment where we're like, all right, and you're just like, what how does that, how do you do, what is that? So yeah, no, for sure. I think that is a sort of a common experience that folks share.
I'll say though, on this point, is I found to not be embarrassed by what I don't know. Throughout law school, I was kind of a little bit more timid, but I spoke to folks in the field, and if you just ask, I always feel like it's better to ask. Is be out there, say like, I don't know what this is. If you rooted in your imposter syndrome, wherever is, I don't know what this word means. Help me out. That'll treat you far better. You'll be served much better by finding that out than trying to hide and not really own your background and who you are.
I think that's great advice. What do you guys think the biggest challenge would be for first gen folks coming to law school, or I guess rather the broader question is trying to become lawyers, trying to to practice, coming from a place where you haven't even gone to school. Like what do you find the biggest challenge to be? I guess I'll start with John.
So for me, and some of this is rooted in an assumption of some kind of economic disparity.
Yeah.
And that was certainly true for me. I didn't have the resources coming into school. My family didn't have a lot of the resources coming into school. So it's really going on your own. So one of the big ones is you need stuff. You need money to get started in this industry.
Yeah.
I mean, from the moment you walk into school, you're supposed to have books on day one, right? And this may be a question further along down the line, but BC doesn't give you your loan disbursement until like a week or two later. So I always went a week with no books. Or borrowing people's books because I couldn't afford that first semester's books when you need to turn over $1,000 or $2,000 or however much money it costs. You need suits, right? This is an industry, or suits of professional clothing. You need quite a bit of it. Once things started to open up, and I'm sure you start to go.
And none of this is tuition. This is all in addition to
exactly
it's cost of doing business.
And like I had to borrow for whatever else I needed. Now the piper's coming. Now he say, hey, student loans, you got to start paying those now. And so there's the resource issue, right? getting started. And then, as I said, is kind of like the networks where you have to start from scratch. You don't have the connections. You don't know people. You don't know how to operate in these spaces.
And that takes time to build those connections, man.
Absolutely.
Time is money.
And, when you're doing those connections, is one of the things is how do you connect with people when their world experience is so vastly different from yours, right? If people start talking about golf, I had never golfed except for putt-putt up until, BC did its practice golf course, right? I literally light the green on fire when I take it's sparking every time. Golf is just not my thing, right? But a lot of attorneys, they'll just talk about golf.
Yeah.
So it's really a space that's not designed or designed for first generation people in mind.
Yeah, that's funny. Sydney?
I would also kind of agree with the points, especially with, thinking about things like, suits and other resources. It's like that's so important to, going to a networking event or making a good first impression during an interview. And those, that costs money. And that's like something that, factors in a way that I think it's very hard for, people who might not have those means or who are low income. I'd also think, from my perspective, particularly, I felt like, in a profession where you have to kind of learn how to network and how to make connections when those, especially when it's a career where those connections can be very important to future jobs or just figuring out what you want to do in general. I felt like I had to teach myself how to even get into like a pattern of like, reaching out to someone, how to maybe set up like a meeting for coffee and just those little things that could, give me some insight in like a certain practice area or like a certain opportunity. So I think, just kind of, because previously I never thought of having to continuously network in order to really understand my future career. So just getting to the habit of that, I think. And learning those resources is very important.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Really, for both of the things you guys said. I think for one, like you talk about like networking and the time that takes. Like if you come to law school and you've already got a pretty solid network, or you got lawyers in the family or friends, etc. I think you can much more efficiently get connected with folks. Whereas if you come in with none of that, all of the time that you'd otherwise spend working, studying, extracurricular, whatever else you're doing, you're on the phone, you're reaching, you're going to things, you're, sort of making up a lot of that, that yardage that other folks are sort of, they're a little bit further down the field. And just to the golf point, you made me remember this like crazy story I heard here once, just for humor, where somebody was, first gen guy was on a interview. I mean, this guy was a little bit of a character, but he's doing an interview. Gets to the callback, and like the partner, really likes golf. He's like, "Oh yeah," and they get to talking about golf, and he's like, "Oh, do you like golf?" It's like, "Yeah, I like golf. What do you shoot?" And the guy makes up a score. I think it was like, "Oh, I shoot like a 75." It's like some insane score, relatively speaking. He's like, "Oh, well, a couple of us are going golfing, so you want to come with us?" And it's like, not gonna go figure out how to golf. Like, oh my god, they're gonna realize I'm a fraud. But I think that's an extreme, sort of humorous example. But yeah, there is all sort of like this gamesmanship of like just trying to get to be on par. Too many golf puns here. With where it feels like your peers are. Like, there's definitely a lot of investment that has to go into that, time wise, money wise, certainly.
I think that story is pretty telling though, because they were about to create a networking opportunity over golf. Right. So if you're from a background where you never play golf, now you're in that guy's position where you either lie, or I wouldn't have lied, but now that he's lied, he's now got to pony up. Or if he says no, then he misses that networking opportunity, because then whoever he was interviewing with was like, oh, okay, let's move on. Yeah. And now you don't have that chance.
And it's almost like a cultural thing. It's like, oh, we play golf. You don't like golf. Right. Like there's exactly.
But the next candidate who does play golf, now that candidate is golfing with the partner or the interviewer or whomever instead of you.
Or like, what are other, like, skiing, or, you did
horseback
crew in
riding,
college. I went to
lacrosse.
regattas. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, we're not, didn't grow up doing that. So I wanted to talk to next, just about like potential, solutions, that the profession and in law schools might be able to think about in regards to maybe solving some of these things. Just some statistics I was looking at before we sat down. It seems like this, there's a variety of different affinity groups that we've become, I think, a lot more progressive in recent years in terms of trying to reach out to. But it does feel like FGP is one that can fall through the cracks a little bit. Like, it feels like just now we're sort of talking about it a little bit more. There's an article that I looked at from Carolyn Kitchener. She's the author of Postgrad, 5 Women in Their First Year Out of College. She wrote an article in The Atlantic a few years ago. It was a piece called and she's not hiding the ball at all with this title. It's called How the LSAT Destroys Socioeconomic Diversity. She writes that while law schools are steadily becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, they remain overwhelmingly upper middle class. Only 5% of students at elite law schools come from families that fall in the bottom half of the socioeconomic spectrum, a number that has hardly changed since the 1960s. In another article, Harvard has 15 times as many students from the richest fifth of the population as the poorest fifth, but as many students come from the top 1% by income as the bottom 60%. So sort of pretty jarring numbers here that it seems like have really stood the test of time. So given like the sort of economic roots of a lot of this, like what do you think like we can do, the law schools, the profession to try to do better?
I guess I'll just start off by saying that it seems like that, FGP clubs across different campuses have been fairly new. In conversations that I've had with different law schools in the Boston area about their FGP clubs, it's like we all started within 5 years.
Right.
And so I think that, and we're just really starting to talk now. And I think that has, kind of, shows that there's still a lot to work on, and there's still a lot to see, like how we can work together and maybe how we can make more broad change, since we're all kind of like starting out in our little groups and really trying to build a community at this moment. Like, what is it going to look like maybe 10, 15 years, and we can maybe, really join those resources and really, emphasize those problems.
Yeah. I wanted to ask also about, this sort of getting away from, the sort of like the finances, the numbers, the statistics, but it's sort of the culture. I think law has its own culture for better and for worse, and that's in law schools and at law firms. It's the stuff of TV shows, Suits and Law and Order. I mean, there's no shortage of these shows that sort of trade on
My cousin Vinny.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sort of trade on that culture. It's a massive aspect of, going into the profession. And, there's this expression in sports, act like you've been there. And it can be hard for folks who are first gen to act like you've been there when you haven't. You go to networking events or, you interview. I think that's sort of a central law school experience as everybody, goes through these law firm interviews or, wherever it is that folks choose to interview. And I was just curious, like, what your experience with like culture has been like, first in law school and then, in the professional setting when you're networking and, going to firms and other places, like what that sort of cultural experience, has been like.
Culture. Interesting kind of topic there. Each law firm will think of their own culture in a different way. But kind of, I think your question is more toward the legal community culture. It's an interesting one. For me, I knew nothing about the law, right? And I feel like a lot of the time when you come here, at least when I assumed everyone's going to think, yeah, you always got to know everything. You got to be very smart. You got to be put together. There's not a lot of room for error. And when you're practicing, you do make errors, but the legal culture is a lot more forgiving than we think, because you see these TV shows, which is my primary experience with the legal industry, at least from the law firm side, was these hyper intelligent, super well put together people. They're worldly, they'd been all over, they know what's going on, and it was just kind of this unapproachable group to me. But in reality, the lawyers that I met, especially through BC, have all been incredibly nice, incredibly understanding, incredibly willing to help. And to me, that's been a beautiful surprise about the legal industry, where the attorneys, by and large, as far as I found, are a very nice bunch, very much more relaxed than I thought, more approachable. And as I say, I always tell people, hey, just send me an email if you want to have a coffee. There's like a 99% chance that I'll respond yes. We'll make it work. It might not happen today, but for the most part, the culture of practicing attorneys is to give back, because we remember what it's like to be a law student.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's been my experience as well. I mean, I think you have a variety of experiences, but primarily when it comes to networking, sending those emails and reaching out to folks, that the worst that'll happen is somebody's too busy and they can't get back to you. But no one's going to be like, oh, how dare you? Like that's not. Everyone's very nice and wants to talk and wants to help. I think that's certainly the case. I think at the same time though, there can be more towards like the recruiting like setting. You go to interviews and things, and there is. There's like so much that's done about getting ready for those, and it's like it's unlike hiring in other professions, whereas it's like, okay, there's a screener, then there's a callback, and they're going to ask you why this firm. Why it's sort of, there's a rigidity that it feels like is kind of baked in there, which I think some people come sort of speaking the same language, if that makes sense, whereas there's other folks where, I guess just to like use myself as an example, I got a Boston accent and I've got the background that I have. Am I the same cut of character that they're used to? You're aware of these things. You're sort of thinking about like, okay, well, how do I talk to these people? Is there certain certain languages or certain are they looking through me? Do they think I'm like an imposter? These are sort of things that are in your head. And I think something we were talking about before, but what can be done about this? Like I almost think that. And I know schools do it, to some extent, like almost having like, first year, 1L, like whether it's like some seminar or something that's like kind of baked into, your curriculum to where they're teaching about interviewing and it's not to say like we don't know how to be professional and like go to events, but when you're talking to lawyers, you're talking to firms, there's a certain, just understanding how the interview process works, like understanding like, okay, here are some important things, best practices, et cetera. I think all of that, is helpful because, people are coming from backgrounds with different levels of familiarity, with all of that. Sydney, did you want to?
Yeah, so I think on that point, I remember doing just some interviews and I'm like, oh my goodness, I only have like 20 minutes to really like, impress
it's very natural,
people,
right?
And it's, I don't know, and then you just, and it's hard to know that you're in a line of maybe 10 people and you're like one of who knows how many people they're going to actually talk to in a day and trying to stand out and, trying to do all that stuff. So I definitely think that can be really tricky. But again, to what was said before is that, sometimes these networking experience can feel very inauthentic. But, I found also that if you email someone and just say, I'm really interested in your practice area, I'm kind of I think I might want to work in that too, or just talking to someone about their firm, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be, a negative experience. Right. So, it's just sometimes scarier to do, especially when probably your first experience networking is kind of like those maybe more stiff receptions. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I remember, my first experience with it was my spring of 1L, where, it was spring of 2021, so everything was still like virtual. It was still like, it was like pre-vaccines, I think, and we did this like virtual platform where it was like, you clicked, I don't know if you like played certain games in school. I forgot the name of it was as a kid, where it's like you...
Musical chairs.
Yeah, or something where it's like you click on like a table and you're waiting for someone to leave, and then you go on, you're like, hi, and like, I remember going to some of these, like watching every student give the same shtick, like, cause it's like we're all kind of fungible as one. We're all kind of the same person, more or less. But yeah, no, there's an art and a science to.
That's why I would say is that we as law students, we feel compelled to give these canned answers, right? But I'm telling you, on the recruiting side, you hear it 400 times, and you kind of hear it that way. And I think people say that they think that they're supposed to say these certain words at the certain times to a certain attorney. That has been in my experience. I always try to tell people is if you're at these events, part of the culture is be yourself, because it's going to get boring if I hear, oh, you have such interesting work and interesting clients. Well, guess what? The same Fortune 500 company is represented by every single law firm that's there. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you got to bring you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that is a great point. It's something that's like easily said, but maybe not so easily done. When you have certain pressures to, hear about how you're supposed to go about these things and what you're supposed to say and what you think they want to hear, and all of that, it can certainly be challenging. Just a couple last questions I wanted to ask. What advice would you give to first gen people out there, not only law students, but maybe like pre-law, thinking about law school, just anywhere in the pipeline? Like what advice would you give, at this point in your, career and your journey, looking backwards? Sydney?
I think for anyone who's kind of pre-law, I would say, first of all, like, it's okay if you don't have a plan 100%. I feel like, as first-gen students, this is a big investment we're making in our time and our education, with the money we're paying and all the student loans. Like, I feel like everyone kind of wants to make sure that, I'm on this path. It's going to be a good one. It's worth the investment. And I think it's hard if you're kind of unsure, like, is this actually for me? And I don't really have the means to really, throw it away. So I think in that front, I would just say, it's okay. You'll meet people, you'll, network, you'll see different things, but just, don't lose confidence or don't feel like it's not for you just because you're not 100% sure. And I think maybe to someone who, is kind of, the summer before their 1L year, I'd just say, you're going to hear a million pieces of advice on the same topic. Especially with outlining exams, some people will say you have to study this way or that way. But, you got into law school. We all know you're smart and you came here with study skills. And, if you just, trust yourself a little bit, it could really pay off.
Awesome. John?
Sure. If you're thinking about applying to law school, the first piece of advice I'd say is just shut out everybody who says don't. Because I feel like that's the meme where, it's like, oh, you're thinking about being a lawyer, just forget it.
Yeah.
This industry is incredibly rewarding. It is intellectually stimulating. Your power to give back on pro bono matters and help disenfranchise people is incredible. The look when you're representing somebody who thought that, everything was over, and then all of a sudden, you have the legal power, even as a law student, as somebody in the clinic, to get behind them, it's life-changing for them.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in practicing law, absolutely consider it. Next thing is, as Sydney said, is this going to be the right move for me? If you're from, first generation background where you don't have money to gamble, $200,000, $300,000 on an education, and then ultimately you can't do public interest, or maybe you want to, you got to kind of think about, like, am I in this for the money, or am I going to try and, go the public interest route and then maybe get some loan forgiveness? But I would say is that you need to be a bit more targeted. And I say that knowing full well that when I came to law school, I didn't know what I was going to do.
Right.
Those two things exist. I just knew that I want to practice this way at this type of firm, even if I don't know the name of it. And then I calculated the money, the investment's going to be worth it. Because I had that goal and that drive, and I was single-minded in achieving that kind of directed all of my other efforts. The next piece of advice I would say is reach out and talk to attorneys who are doing the things you're doing or working the places that you're working. I did not know anything about law school coming in. The only way I was able to survive was asking my peers who were ahead of me, who were on the track that I wanted, or practicing attorneys who had already done through everything. What do I do?
Yeah.
They gave me their advice. I received a bunch of advice, but I kind of synthesized it, and I said, I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm going to follow their playbook. And different people can do different things. I got a playbook from my affinity group. I was a member of BALSA. I had great mentors there say, this is how you're going to do well on an exam. This is how you're going to network. This is how you're going to do this. I liked what they did. I liked what they said, and I executed. I reached out to attorneys, and they said yes. And then I listened to them and figured out, okay, how do I work at your firm?
Yeah.
Do these things, get these grades, talk to these people. And I just kind of executed in that way. And that's, but roundabout way of saying, reach out to people who are where you want to be and just listen.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's great advice. Last question I wanted to ask, just to bring it home. There's so much about, I think when you apply to law school, it feels like the two most important things are your LSAT and your GPA. And then when you're trying to get a job, it feels like there's there's GPA, there's were you on law review, were you on moot court. And, they're going to look at other parts of your resume, but it can feel like at each juncture along the trajectory, you're merely a few data points that they're looking at. It's like the rest of the story, the rest of it doesn't really click unless those things are, are there. And I think folks that are, from, I think of, variety of backgrounds, whether that's, other, you mentioned BALSA, I think, we've got a lot of great, student organizations that recognize, diversity in a number of ways, or your first gen, there's a lot that's there that, well, if, you don't quite have the 3.98 and you aren't on law, well, then you're kind of at a disadvantage. But that person certainly has a lot of perspective and they've faced adversity. And there's a lot that's in that background that might not translate into what the law school sees or what the law firm sees when you're applying to firms. And so when you're, at these, points where you're interviewing or whatever the case may be, how would you translate that experience into, and they say, tell me about you, why a lot, how would you translate that when it comes time to have those conversations, those experiences?
Sure. I'll kick that one off. The best advice I got was from a recruiter, and this was my fall semester of 1L, so I really hadn't even seen any grades yet. And they said, your GPA is kind of your ticket into the door.
Yeah.
It's not the end all be all. It's not going to make or break it. But at the end of the day, again, this is strictly from a kind of law firm perspective here. They want to see a GPA. That's the truth of the matter. Is you just as long as it doesn't have to be the perfect one. You don't have to be the 3.9. In fact, if you're a 3.9, they might look at you a little bit weird because it's like, why is this guy's or this girl's grade so
Does he
high?
have a life?
Yeah, are you interesting? Because
Are you just a bot?
Yeah, are you a bot? But if you have the grade to get in the door, then you sell the deal. So if you're a first gen person, and you're looking, make sure that you at least can say you can justify to get yourself in the door, and then once you get to that point, sell who you are and be authentic. I didn't hide the ball. They said, "Why do you want to practice in big law?" I said, "Because I need to make money." I didn't hide that, and then I said, "I need to make money." The 08 recession wasn't great for my family. I'm in this to make money. I'm in this to be very successful. I want to be at the top of my trade in everything I do because I can't afford to fail, literally. And, for a lot of them, they said, hey, that's great. I like the honesty. I like the candor. And I was just authentically myself throughout the process. And I was authentically myself throughout law school. And that was a bit of a challenge. I thought about, should I try to hide back or not? But truth of the matter is, I loved law school.
Yeah.
I loved the professors. I loved the subject matter. And the best advice that I always got, and I keep saying, is be yourself, be authentic. Your GPA will get you into the door, but don't be somebody you're not. Be interesting.
Yeah.
Because if you have a cool background where, you grew up on a farm in Texas, even if I've never been on a farm, I would love to hear that.
Yeah.
Right? You don't need to tell me or try to appeal to some golf story,
Right.
Because if I'm interviewing you, that's not my experience, so lost.
For sure. Sydney?
I guess I would kind of start off by saying that I feel like, a GPA is definitely a ticket into the door, but I also feel like a GPA can tell a story as well. Like you can, have, speaking just like your 1L year, you can have a good GPA, your first semester, but if you improve, I feel like that tells a big story in, overcoming obstacles. I feel like that's something you can talk about in your interviews, how you overcame those challenges and whatnot. I think I would also say is, sometimes what you're asked in an interview will be very random. You'll never expect it. So I've had a lot of times where I'm, when I've been interviewed and, coming from Western Mass, and we'll be like, I know your hometown. And that's something that I thought they would never really care about, but it's like a conversation starter. So I think really just, leaning into maybe having those like casual aspects in a conversation, or really, if someone's trying to reach a hand out in that way, just really taking it, because it could really be something that someone remembers you by.
Awesome.